Let me first of all thank Ray Ryan for his support throughout the research and writing of tragedy and postcolonial literature. Ray is the very best editor and advocate I have ever worked with, and I count him as both a friend and the most robust critic I could possibly imagine. Ray is brutally honest when speaking his mind. There are people I know who cannot take his candor, but I flourish on it because I know that the target he sets for me and for himself is that of high excellence at all times. As the Akans put it, when a man is cutting a path through the forest, he does not know whether the path is straight or crooked. It is left for others to tell him. The argument of my book turns on two primary questions. These pertain first to the impediments to the exercise of ethical choice under different social and political conditions, and second, to the problem of giving a coherent account of oneself when the instruments of such self-accounting are felt to be inadequate or otherwise compromised by history. Many tragic themes become relevant to these two questions, such as suffering, the relationship between ethical choice making and the contingent conditions that surround it, the vagaries of reputation as it is tied to the opinion of others, the ambiguation of attitudes to collective and individual pasts, and the role of a witness-bearing community to the collapse of the tragic self. My emphasis in the book is primarily on the representation of pathos and suffering, rather than on fate, necessity, and catastrophe. And at the most basic level, I define suffering as the experience or perception of impending threats of disintegration of the self. My original cue for this basic definition of suffering comes from the medical humanities, and specifically from Eric J. Cassell's The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine, where he argues for tying medical discourse directly to specific definitions of personhood and not merely to abstractions. Another important inspiration for my thoughts on suffering come from Cicero's Tusculan Disputation on Grief, where he argues that strong emotions such as fear and envy are overwhelming to reason. While Cicero is clearly arguing from a Stoic perspective, what is most fascinating to me is the degree to which almost all of what he says in the Disputation on Grief has already been contradicted in his own personal responses to the death of his daughter Tullia, who died some 5 months before he embarked on the disputations. We know how Cicero responded to her death in childbirth because of the many letters he wrote about it to his friend Lucius Atticus Pomponius, where Cicero described, among other things, his persistent tearfulness, his loss of appetite, the alternation between anger, abjection, and self-pity, and even the contemplation of suicidal thoughts. The Stoic philosophical disposition he adopts in the Disputation on Grief is a way then to stem the tide of his own suffering, and I think must be read alongside his responses to his daughter's death as a way of identifying gaps and contradictions in the idea of suffering. It has to be noted, however, that the conditions pertaining to the disintegration of the self vary, but that a provisional list would likely include items such as extreme poverty and material lack, ill health, the loss of family and friends, as well as the collapse of hermeneutical systems. Some of what I list here coincides with Aristotle's discussion of what constitutes the good life in the Nicomachean Ethics. And indeed, I devote a substantial amount of time in tragedy and postcolonial literature, threading insights from both the ethics and the poetics for elaborating my own views on tragedy. I also draw on insights from Frantz Fanon, especially what I designate as systematic delirium that I glean from Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon and Samuel Beckett bookend my sense of systematic delirium from the perspective of the discombobulation of the Black body within the psychoexistential complex defined by colonial racial economies and the randomization of causes and effects, respectively. This also means that both Fanon and Beckett allow us to re-evaluate Aristotle's theory of tragedy, a re-evaluation that I elaborate in the book. Finally, to augment these two concept clusters, I add that of Musuo, which is derived from the culture of the Akan people from which I hail. Musuo is typically translated simply as taboo, but I try to show how among the Akan, the concept also implies the contamination of the witness-bearing community and their implicatedness in the tragic choices of a tragic agent. I find the concept of Musuo useful for qualifying and resituating the Aristotelian idea of anagnorisis, which I take not merely to be meaning recognition, as is typically translated in English, but rather as capturing something of the tortured elusiveness of self-awareness that often comes too late in the tragic protagonist's life cycle. Musuo allows me to consider anagnorisis as also an element of the community's bearing of witness to tragedy, where sometimes catharsis is not entirely available, but what is required are acts of ablution, hermeneutical reinterpretation, and also simply a quest for justice. I'm going to try to elaborate these key principles of tragedy and postcolonial literature in the rest of this lecture. With respect to how to define postcolonialism, the other key term in the book's title, like most scholars in the field, I note first of all that postcolonialism is as much a reflection on conditions under imperialism and colonialism proper as they are about conditions coming after the historical end of empires. In other words, that the post in the term is not merely a temporal marker, but the sign of a set of theoretical orientations. I have dedicated an episode on postcolonialism on critic reading writing, my channel on YouTube. So I urge that those who have not seen it yet take a look at it for a more comprehensive definition. For now, I want just to note two distinctions I draw upon for understanding the subject area that falls under the rubric of postcolonialism. The distinction I draw is that between external and internal colonialism. In external colonialism, colonial space making was primarily about the conquest and control of far-flung territories. As you will see when you watch the episode on critic reading writing, this coincides more or less with the first category I discussed in my typology of colonial space making. Examples of external colonialism would include the British administrative setup in India and Nigeria, the French in Martinique, the Portuguese in Brazil and Angola, and the Spanish in Mexico and Argentina, among various others. In contrast to external colonialism, internal colonialism has to be understood as depending on population management principles for dealing with heterogeneous populations and often establishing distinctions between races and ethnicities that are closely related. The various diasporas from the global south that reside in various metropolises of the global north in the 20th and 21st centuries serve to compound the picture of internal colonialism even further. Whether in its external or internal variants, colonial spacemaking ultimately involves the differential constitution of citizens and subjects. At any rate, the principle of internal colonialism allows us to apply postcolonial forms of analysis to China's treatment of their minority Muslim Uyghur population today, or Russia's erstwhile treatment of its Jewish population that was confined to the Pale of Settlement from 1791 to 1919, and most pertinently, of the long and complicated colonial history of Ireland, as well as the situation in Palestine. For Ireland especially presents more diverse spectrums of colonial spacemaking practices than either Nigeria or India, for example, and that these range from settler colonialism through white slavery, and even partition. The point is that viewed from the perspective not of external territorial conquest and control, but rather of the regulation of heterogeneous populations, internal colonialism helps pinpoint different phases of colonial space-making practices in places that have not been conventionally considered to fall under the purview of classic postcolonial studies. Chapters in the book include ones on Shakespeare's Othello, Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Tayyip Saleh, Toni Morrison, Arundhati Roy, J.M. Coetzee, and Samuel Beckett, with a wider range of references to tragedies from different literary traditions. What I want to set out now are three tragic situations that I look at in the book. I'm going to use these examples to unthread a number of observations to do with colonial spacemaking, epistemological crises, the relationship between anagnorisis and Musuo, and the unstable place of witness-bearing communities. I'm going to let the literary examples do the theorizing for me. So you may find that there will be many digressions and points of non-convergence in what I'm going to lay out. The first extract comes from Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart in the penultimate chapter. The scene in question takes place at the Ilo or marketplace, where Okonkwo's tribesmen and women have been called together to discuss what response might be appropriate to the egregious insult visited upon Umuofia's elders by the white district commissioner. On the pretense of inviting the elders to join him for a palaver, the district commissioner had them suddenly disarmed and handcuffed by the court messengers just when their delegation leader was about to speak. The elders suffer the added humiliation of having their heads shaved clean with a blunt razor blade. They are finally released upon the payment of 250 bags of cowrie shells, the figure having been inflated by the court messengers for their own profit. Thus, when Umuofia gathers to talk at the marketplace, the mood is far from light-hearted. There is a sense of ominous expectancy in the air. Okonkwo is sitting at the edge of the gathered crowd. And this is what we see. At this point, there was a stir in the crowd and every eye was turned in one direction. There was a sharp bend in the road that led from the marketplace to the white man's court and to the stream beyond it. And so no one had seen the approach of the 5 court messengers until they had come round the bend, a few paces from the edge of the crowd. Okonkwo was sitting at the edge. He sprang to his feet as soon as he saw who it was. He confronted the head messenger, trembling with hate, unable to utter a word. The man was fearless and stood his ground, his 4 men lined up behind him. In that brief moment, the world seemed to stand still, waiting. There was utter silence. The men of Umuofia were merged into the mute backcloth of trees and giant creepers, waiting. The spell was broken by the head messenger. "Let me pass," he ordered. "What do you want here?" "The white man, whose power you know too well, has ordered this meeting to stop." In a flash, Okonkwo drew his machete. The messenger crouched to avoid the blow. It was useless. Okonkwo's machete descended twice, and the man's head lay beside his uniformed body. The waiting backcloth jumped into tumultuous life, and the meeting stopped. Okonkwo stood looking at the dead man. He knew that Umuofia would not go to war. He knew because they had let the other messengers escape. They had broken into tumult instead of action. He discerned fright in the tumult. He heard voices asking, "Why did he do it?" Things to note about this passage. First is the sense of suppressed anticipation, which presents itself almost like being played out before a primal backdrop. As we are told, in that brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. There was utter silence. The men of Umuofia were merged into the mute backcloth of trees and giant creepers, waiting. This moment of primalness suggests that it is one in which literally anything could happen. There are many moments of this kind in world literature, including in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where the Congo River and its forests are considered to be a reversion to the beginning of the world. Achebe was, of course, a sharp critic of Conrad, but the trope of primalness is clearly shared by the two writers at various points. Second, and most important, is the epistemological crisis represented in his people's tremulous question, "Why did he do it?" 200 pages earlier, this would have been a complete non-question, since the answer would have been a straightforward declaration of war. But this no longer seems to be possible. And yet, to understand what amounts to a epistemological impasse that Okonkwo's action in killing the messenger presents to his people, we're required to go back to the changes that have taken place in Umuofia, not only in the material conditions of the clan, but also in the entire ordering of their symbolic apparatus that is also grounded in a particular form of spatial logic. For in Umuofia, the Ilo marketplace is shown to be the site of collective communal affirmation, where they meet for the annual wrestling match, for the masked Egungun spirits of the ancestors to sit in judicial process, and also where the clan gather to deliberate on matters of war and peace. Contrasted to this space of collective affirmations is the evil forest, where people suffering from unnameable diseases are cast out to die, and entities considered somewhat anomalous, such as twins, are also cast out. The evil forest is the place of sacred dread. When the Christians arrive and ask for a piece of land to build their church, the Igbo people mischievously give them a piece of the evil forest, with the idea that they will soon have the chance to prove the strength of their God and his son Jesus Christ against the formidable wrath of their own Igbo gods. This is not what happens. Instead, the new church seems to live utterly peacefully inside the evil forest. The effect after a few weeks is that the church starts getting new converts, among them people that have had to cast away their twin children, as well as the Osu, the community of people dedicated to a sacred cult that were not allowed to mingle with the freeborn. But the effect of the Christian occupancy of the evil forest is that they end up altering the significance of that site of sacred dread and rather recode it as the place of an alternative matrix of self-making, as well as of a new meritocracy. But this also means that the evil forest has shifted within the symbolic sacred economy of the clan. And by implication, the Ilo and marketplace have also concomitantly shifted. Thus, when Okonkwo's machete descends against the background of the gathered clan at the marketplace, that space is no longer the space of straightforward communal affirmations. And it is for this that Okonkwo's action generates bewilderment and epistemological impasse. The second extract comes from Wole Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman. Death and the King's Horseman is Soyinka's most well-known play and presents an almost perfect interpretation of the elements of error of judgment, reversal of fortune, and anagnorisis that would have been much appreciated by Aristotle. It also has a number of other elements that are reminiscent of the Greeks, such as a strong degree of disputatiousness, a carefully choreographed chorus function, and an idea of the pharmakos or sacrificial carrier that aligns sacrifice directly to the welfare of the polis. The emotional crux of the play centers on the failed ritual suicide of Eleshin Oba, the king's horseman of the title, who by tradition is supposed to extinguish himself some 40 days after the death of the king. Eleshin is prevented from accomplishing this when he is interrupted in the ritual by the Colonial District Commissioner. After the failure of the ritual crossing, Iyaloja, head of market women, comes to bitterly accost him and to rain insults on him. And this is what we see. Iyaloja, you have betrayed us. We fed you sweetmeats, such as we hoped awaited you on the other side. But you said, no, I must eat the world's leftovers. We said you were the hunter who brought the quarry down. To you belonged the vital part of the game. No, you said, I am the hunter's dog, and I shall eat the entrails of the game and the feces of the hunter. We said you were the hunter returning home in triumph, a slain buffalo pressing down on his neck. You said, wait, I must first turn up this cricket hole with my toes. We said yours was the doorway at which we first spy the tapper when he comes down from the tree. Yours was the blessing of the twilight wine, the pearl that brings night spirits out of doors to steal their portion before the light of day. We said yours was the body of wine whose burden shakes the tapper like a sudden gust on his perch. You said, no, I am content to lick the dregs from each calabash when the drinkers are done. We said the dew on the earth's surface was for you to wash your feet along the slopes of honor. You said, no, I shall step into the vomit of cats and droppings of mice. I shall fight them for the leftovers of the world. The force of these accusations derives largely from the fact that each of them is a play on aspects of Ogun. For Ogun is traditionally the Yoruba tutelary deity of hunters, with palm wine as his dedicated drink. Iyaloja's reverse Oriki declamations retract the ritual elicitation that had first been established by praise singer, another character. Iyaloja denudes election of any semblance of cultural representationality. His failure at the ritual suicide is a musuo that threatens the existential security of the entire community. Thus, Iyaloja's words instigate a damaging deflation that takes place within a material and spatial domain that is distinctly different from what we saw in the marketplace scene that opened the play. The resplendent materiality of the open-air marketplace is contrasted with the bare mustiness of the former slave dungeon in which election is held. And the cultural expressiveness of praise singer and the market woman is contrasted with a confrontation between a cultural spokesperson and an erstwhile cultural icon that has suddenly lost all rights of recognition. Iyaloja, shortly after this exchange, says that she wishes she could pity Election Oba, to which he responds that he needs not pity but understanding. We see the template of epistemological crisis once again, but this time coded around a slightly different problematic. For in the scene, Election Oba is being scaled down from an epic representative figure to that of a mere individual. That is to say, his crisis is being interpreted by Iyaloja and the rest of the community as a personal failure that nevertheless carries collective consequences. The emphasis in her Oriki retractions is in the personal rather than on the collective. Additionally, and even more important from Iyaloja's perspective, is that election's failure to undertake the crossing is a musuo that unleashes the threat of metaphysical destruction upon the entire community. Here, they do not bear witness to grant him pity or empathy, but rather to condemn him soundly. The third extract is from Toni Morrison's Beloved and pertains to the character of Baby Suggs, mother-in-law of Sethi, the central character who kills her daughter to prevent her and her other children from being recaptured back into slavery. The event of Sethi's cutting of her daughter's neck is witnessed by 4 different focalizing characters. Baby Suggs is the only one of the 4 focalizers who responds to the event not as a lover, Paul D., a helpful neighbor, Stamp Paid, or a theorizing sadist, the school teacher, but as a mother. For Baby Suggs, her witnessing of Sethi's choice also induces a decomposition of her big heart and her great faith. This is from having to bear witness to the tragic tableau of which she herself is also a part. The scene of Sethi's killing of her daughter may also be described as offering a split anagnorisis. Even though Sethi is the central protagonist and on an Aristotelian reading would be the one to bear anagnorisis in the moment, it can also be argued that Baby Suggs also suffers a moment of unsettling recognition of the fact that as an ex-slave, her freedom was false because the slave master could invade that space of freedom and again impose a definition of unfreedom upon it. This definition is backed by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The events laid out in Morrison's novel are drawn from the real-life events surrounding the life of the fugitive slave Margaret Garner, who in 1856 escaped from Kentucky across the frozen Ohio River, and when she was about to be apprehended by slave catchers, killed her 2-year-old daughter and attempted to kill her other children. What Baby Suggs witnesses in the novel induces a deep existential crisis that she will never be able to recover from. Her entire world is utterly discombobulated. What I have to do, she tells Stampede as he tries to encourage her to go back to the clearing where she used to preach, is get in my bed and lay down. I want to fix on something harmless in this world. The conversation continues. What world you talking about? Ain't nothing harmless down here. Yes, it is. Blue. That don't hurt nobody. Yellow neither. You getting in bed to think about yellow? I likes yellow. Then what? When you get through with blue and yellow, then what? Can't say. It's something can't be planned. For someone whose entire life has been spent healing others and giving of her mighty heart, this is an extremely painful moment. But the point is that for Baby Suggs, she can neither condone nor condemn Sethi's terrible choice. Not only does she experience a split anagnorisis, Sethi's killing of her daughter is a dark moment that she feels deeply contaminated by. My final question is, what is the point of tragedy, of Aristotle, of postcolonialism in our world today? I would like to provide a provisional answer to this question by turning our attention to the death of George Floyd, but to treat it in exactly the same way as I would have treated the literary examples. If we consider the scene of the killing of George Floyd on May 25th of 2020 as a tableau, we are able to interpret it within certain tragic parameters. The scene itself presents certain spatial logics of both a horizontal and vertical kind. And so the white uniformed police officer putting his knee, pressing his knee upon the neck of the black man lying prostrate. And so the vertical pressing on the horizontal. The black man lying down, helpless, calls for his dead mother. And by that call, gives us all a shudder because we know that all our mothers are being hailed. Beside them, the police car, which is at once a symbol of modernity, since the automobile has been an engine of modernity since the early 20th century. And yet at the same time, it is the bearer of death, coded as security, police security. All these play out on the foreground of the scene, but we also know that the scene also has a long historical hinterland of the relations between races in this country, the long violence against black people, of which George Floyd is just one example. There are countless black folk that have been killed by the police. And so this hinterland presses upon the foreground and let us all viewing it know that there's more to this scene than meets the eye. More importantly, from a further tragic perspective, what we are seeing is actually not just the scene of great injustice, because it is plain that some injustice is going on, but it is also the place of a musuo, something dark that we feel contaminated by. Because in this case, we are bearing witness to something that makes us feel soiled and contaminated. And it is this feeling of being soiled and contaminated that then teaches us that catharsis is not possible in the face of injustice. What is required is a quest for justice. And so the fact, of course, that we have been in COVID lockdown, that we're feeling frustrated and so on, coupled to this sense of soiling, of contamination, of dirtying of ourselves, then triggers the many demonstrations and Black Lives Matter declarations in various parts of the world, in Tokyo as much as in Accra, in London, in Paris as much as Minnesota. This outpouring of anguish and anger, I think, is a sign that the scene of contamination galvanizes people to do something. Now, the doing of something is really a quest for justice, because as I said earlier, a catharsis is not possible within the scene. Now, the scene or tableau, as I'm trying to describe it, of George Floyd's death is not the first time that an image has captured our imaginations and made us feel soiled or contaminated. You will recall the image of the 2-year-old Syrian child on a beach in Turkey in 2015. That also shook many people. And well before that, the image of the running napalmed girl in Vietnam in 1963. And around the same time, the image of the self-immolating monk who set himself on fire on a street in Saigon. Each of these images triggered a sense of absolute horror and shock, and galvanized different movements, as which were, in the case of the Vietnam War, it was a quest to wind down the war. And in the case of the little Syrian child, it was to address the Syrian crisis, the crisis of refugees. And many people got behind the question of what to do with the collapse of the nation state and the many refugees. And now we have George Floyd, which image has also generated its own sequences and consequences, all of which add up to the fact that it is justice that we need to correct the tableau of suffering and tragedy. Catharsis has a space on the stage, but it is justice that needs to be pursued in real life. Thank you very much.